All right, so we got just a few slides here left. Just about 17 slides, something like that, to look at. So one of the things that we're introduced to these problems, if you will, right? We have the these supposed conflicting theologies, these apparent doublets, and all sorts of the fact that they're theological biographies, and then some other things that we'll address just about now, as soon as I can make this thing go. So around the early 19th century, with the rise of naturalistic assumptions, people began to reject the supernatural. All right, so what is a naturalistic assumption?
That we're all going to die?
No. That is a natural assumption, but a naturalistic assumption are assumptions that we bring to the table that assume that supernatural things do not take place. Let's just do a poll here. How many of you have been around when somebody walked on water? Legitimately water over their head and they walk on the water. Anybody ever seen that take place? All right, okay, nobody has. Well, how about someone speaking, you're out in the water and someone's speaking to the waves and the waves just die down. Or just in general, someone speaking to the weather and the weather stops. Do we have any experience with that type of thing? All right, well, what about a resurrection from the dead? How many of you have witnessed someone verifiably dead for 3 days, and then buried in the tomb, and then he rise up on the third day? Huh. None of you guys have experienced any of these things, and neither have I. Well, I mean, these are supernatural events that if indeed they happen, they certainly are not a regular part of our everyday experience. Well, with the 19th century and the Enlightenment, it's a kind of a phase of philosophical history. People began to say, well, look, well, first there is, it's kind of difficult to, we could go further back and look at the origin of the species for Charles Darwin. Darwinian evolution gave a way to intelligently articulate the beginning of creation without God, right? It wasn't necessary supposedly for God anymore because time and chance and everything takes place. So you have Darwinism, in the mid like the mid 19th century, really. So you have all of these currents that are swelling in this general time frame, and the net result of it is they said anything supernatural, we know that did not happen. And what you call that is like an a priori assumption. That's assumption that apart from any evidence you bring to the table, and there's just no proving otherwise, that's what you believe. And we all have them. Whether we, depending on, how aware we are that we have them and whatnot, we all have them. Hopefully we're willing to hold those assumptions up to some standard of truth and things of that nature to verify if they're accurate or not. But for most of us, I think we have them. So, early in the set, we have this rejection of supernaturalism, anything supernatural. So given these assumptions, the real Jesus could not have been the Jesus presented in the Gospels. Okay, if you know that miracles don't happen, then is it possible? Is there any way possible that the Jesus presented in the Gospel is real? No. Jesus was a miracle working person. It was tied to his very identity. And so, if you come to the table with the assumption that miracles do not happen, then the Jesus that is presented in the Bible has to be a false Jesus. He cannot be the real one. Does that make sense? So then what do? Well, you have to begin to reinterpret the Gospels under or based upon these new assumptions that you're bringing to the table. So we know that Jesus didn't do miracles, and that people had simple faith during that time, and charlatans and tricksters had been going around selling snake oil forever, and or maybe the miracles were not even said to be done by Jesus. Maybe they were the later addition of the gospel writers. Anyway, they've got to reinterpret them. They've got to do something with this material because it's in their mind it's clearly not accurate. So David Strauss, while no more accepting the historicity of the Gospels than were his rationalistic predecessors, insisted that the Gospels taught truth, but that it was truth of a religious or philosophical nature. Much of the Gospel was made up of myths, stories with a religious value that were important witness to the absolute spirit, a concept taken from the then popular philosophy of Hegel. So Hegelian philosophy. So what David Strauss said is, look, he was no more accepting of the historicity. What is the historicity of something? What's the historicity?
The removal of history.
The what?
The removal of history.
No, it just refers to the fact that something happened. So Strauss did not believe that Jesus walked on water. He didn't believe any of the historicity of the Gospels. But what he did believe is that the Gospels taught truth. Oh, come on. I'm running out of markers like flies. So he did believe that the Gospels taught truth. So what kind of truth did it teach? Well, myths are stories with a religious value. So let me give you an example that kind of bridges the gap between several. Well, let's go on and we'll come back to it. The example. If this is not completely clear to you, fear not, because, like I said, I'll give you an example, and I think it'll all make sense in the end. So Rudolf Bultmann sought to demythologize the Gospels. Remember, a myth was a story with religious value, and what he wanted to do was demythologize. He wanted to take the myth out and get to the absolute spirit of what the Gospels were saying. He sought to penetrate through the layers of the Gospel to find the real truth. How many of you, I'm sure we all have, eaten an ear of corn, from on the stalk, where you cook it with the leaves that are still on it. Mm-hmm. And if you eat the ear of corn, then you have the corn in the middle, with all the little kernels on it. But then on the outside, you have these layers that are that encase the corn. So what Rudolf Bultmann was suggesting, and so this is the truth here, or the the ears of corn, but sorry. Maybe I can't spell this truth written on the side. So this is the truth here, but then you have these layers, and what you need to do is just kind of peel those layers away. So these are the layers of tradition that are added to it. So you peel those layers away, and ultimately you end up with the truth. But all of these layers are the biblical writings, what they actually said. So how did this play out? Well, let's take, for example, the story of the feeding of, I think, 5,000, 4,000, I can't remember. But one of those stories of Jesus feeding the mass number. Jesus says to his disciples, you'll go and get you'll get something to eat for the people. It has this large crowd of people with it. And the story clearly says they didn't have enough to eat, and the people were hungry. So the disciples say, well, how are we going to do this? If we had all this money, we couldn't go out and buy enough to feed these people. But there is this boy who has 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Well, so in the story, Jesus has them sit down in groups of, I think 10 or something, 50 maybe, I think, groups of 50. He has them sit down in groups, whatever size, and then he takes the loaves, the 5 loaves and the 2 fish that the little boy had, he blesses them, distributes them to the people, feeds the whole group of them, and then collects it back, and he has 10 baskets. So he has more than what he started with. Well, that sounds like a miracle to me, right? I don't know any other way to explain that than a miracle. Well, not if but if you know that miracles don't happen, you have to do something with that story. So what, in the hands of someone like Bultmann or D.F. Strauss and these guys, what they did is they said, all right, so we know that miracles don't happen, so we have to explain this in some other way. So how exactly can we explain this? Here's what happened. Jesus said, feed the people. Disciples, we don't have enough food. The little boy was willing to share his food with the crowd. Even though it wasn't enough, he was willing to share his food with the crowd. Well, what that did is that inspired such a spirit of generosity among the people that everyone began sharing their food, and now there was enough food for everyone to eat. Do you see? We've demythologized it. We've taken the husk of the miraculous away to get at the absolute spirit or the truth that is there, and the truth. And the truth is, be kind or share with one another. That's demythologizing. And they did this with the entirety of the Bible, but especially the Gospels. Because they became convinced that the historical Jesus was not the Jesus presented in the Bible. So it's an interesting project, if you will. But I think ultimately it fails. And it just fails to take into account the realities of, the New Testament, right? It's clear. The story of the little boy is not a story of generosity. I'm sorry, I was protecting my voice and now I've ruined it. So, it's not a story of generosity. It's a miracle story. And to take that from that, you've made it something other than what it was. So that's the quest for the historical Jesus. Because we know that the real Jesus is different from the Jesus of the Gospels. So we've got to find him. Jesus Seminar was another more modern effort that was going on, even in 2000, there were still vestiges of it. It still may be going on now. It's pretty much, as best I can tell, it's pretty much defunct. But it was kind of more of the same. If I had my voice, I'd explain it to you, but it's not important enough to trouble myself. So, all right. So this is the last thing we're going to look at, and this is the idea of the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels. So here's what people started to recognize, things along this line. So let's just kind of look at this top line here. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. And he said, what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable shall we use? It is like a grain of mustard seed which is sown in the ground. Or, what is the kingdom of God like? And what shall I compare it? It is like the grain of a mustard seed which a man took and sowed in the garden. Now we could go here, and this is laid out such that the similarities are kind of in parallel. It has grown, it grows, it grew, it became a tree, became larger than the plants of the garden and put on branches, the largest of the plants of the garden, and becomes a tree. The birds make their nest in it, the birds of the air make their nest in its shade, the birds of the air come and make their nest in its branches. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Pretty similar, right? It's clear that these accounts were written with some knowledge of one another. And what we mean by synoptic gospels is we're talking about the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are your three synoptic gospels. And they are, in essence, we have to, people have wanted to, I don't know necessarily that we have to, but people have wanted to explain the similarities between these gospels. So we're seeing the study of the synoptic problem. That's the same thing, the synoptic problem. Explains the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels. All right. Let's take into account some of the facts that we know. Facts on the ground concerning the relationship between these Gospels. There are verbal parallels among the synoptics. Over 97% of Mark's words have a parallel in Matthew, and over 88% have a parallel in Luke. Notice that we're saying that these are verbal parallels. The parallels are almost certainly too close to say or to pass it off as merely oral tradition. It's clear that we had some copying here. Now, we're in a college class and you say, oh, they plagiarized. Well, I guess if you did that now, we would call it plagiarism. And we would fail you would get in serious trouble because the whole source of the work is is plagiarized. I don't think that's the intent, and they didn't view it as such. Instead, it was probably broadly known. These similarities were probably broadly known and completely accepted. So over 97% of the words that are found in Mark have a parallel with Matthew. And 88% of Mark's words have a parallel in Luke. Does that make sense? All right, so that's the first fact that we have to deal with. The second fact that we have to deal with where are we not turning? That's the same one. Matthew and Luke. So Matthew and Luke have in common 250 verses that are not in Mark. So these are the basic facts as they stand. 97%. Mark has 97% parallel with Matthew. Or 97% of the words in Mark are found in Matthew. 88% of the words in Mark are found in Luke. And yet Matthew and Luke have 250 verses in common that are not found in Mark. That, in essence, is the synoptic problem. How do you deal with these facts? What do they say? The verbal parallels between Matthew and Luke is significant enough to suggest that they are at least part shared a common written source. So these 250 verses that are parallel in Mark, they're close enough to suggest they at least in part share a common written source. The solution, as best I can tell, is solved by what we call the Markan priority. The Markan priority. Given the verbal parallels between Mark, Matthew, and Luke, it's difficult to explain why Mark would have been written. Now think about this. If you let's say you're Mark and you want to write a gospel. Would you, if 97% of what you wanted to say was already contained in Matthew and 88% in Luke, would you write it? I mean, if you write something, if you're going to go through the trouble of writing something, then you have to have something unique to contribute. And so it's very difficult to explain why Mark would have written given these realities. And you have this agreement where Mark and Matthew will frequently agree, and Luke and Mark will frequently agree, kind of in the wordings, but Matthew and Luke rarely agree. Apart from these 250 verses. But on these shared verses, Matthew and Luke are not agreeing, whereas we do have this agreement this way. I like this better. So, well, no, let's go back. Excuse me. Here I'm at the very end, I'll lose it. All right. So how do we explain these realities? These realities contained right here. Well, probably it's explained by what we call the two-source hypothesis. It is a hypothesis. It's a belief of what took place, but it's believed that Mark was written first, and Matthew borrowed from Mark, and Luke borrowed from Mark. And then Mark and Luke had a common source, probably written what is known as Q, or which is known as Q, or Quella, which simply means source. Q or Quella, which simply means source. So this is likely the explanation for this, at least as far as I can tell. It doesn't, at this point, we're not taking away from the authority of Scripture. That's not what's in question. We're just seeking to say, okay, we have these similarities here, these facts. So how do you deal with them? What do we have to say about them? And what I think we have to say about them is the two-source hypothesis. As far as the order that the documents were written, it's probably Mark, Matthew, and then Luke. Mark was written first, then Matthew, and then Luke. For a long time it was believed, because Matthew was the first gospel, they just assumed that they were written in that order. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Keep in mind, notice the synoptic gospels are not treating the gospel of John. John is not a synoptic gospel. It's very unique. It's unique in style, stories that are told. We went through all the similarities. All of those things are there that I referenced. As far as the general teaching, who Jesus was, what he did, what he was about, all of those things are similar. Nevertheless, there are unique stories, unique wording, all of those things. So John is not treated in here, but we are treating with the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Okay? Questions about the synoptic problem? Any questions about demythologizing? Or the quest for the historical Jesus? All right.